Dave Talks Comics, Episode 43, Baltimore Comic-Con 2014, Part 1 of 3. Dave Talks Comics is usually a podcast on the subjects of comic books and cartoons, and usually I talk about the comics I have read and the cartoons I have watched. But I just got back from my day at Baltimore Comic-Con. That was yesterday, and so this time around and for the next two episodes, I am going to talk about what I saw, the panels I saw and the books I bought and things along those lines. So it's going to be all about Baltimore Comic-Con. I usually talk about there being spoilers, that something might get spoiled. I seriously doubt I'm going to spoil anything in this episode, but I suppose there's a possibility. I do talk about some old stories, but only very brief ways. I mean, I mentioned that, well, okay, I won't say that. But I don't think there's anything really spoilery in this. So, in this first part, I'm going to talk about my trip. When I first got there, I walked around the con, so I'm going to talk about that and some of the things I bought. And then I'm going to talk about the first panel I went to, which was the Creator Spotlight panel, I believe is what they call it, and it was on Dave Gibbons. Baltimore Comic-Con 2014. I'm back from my one day at the con, which was Saturday, and I did a lot of shopping, a little more than I intended to do. I made it to 3 panels like I intended to, although I changed up one of the panels. I only went to 2 of the ones I originally said I was going to go to. And, yeah, so let me go through what happened. After I left my car in the parking lot, I parked at a University of Maryland, Baltimore County? University of Maryland, certainly, parking lot. It cost me $9 to park there for the day, which seemed a reasonable rate. If I had parked closer to the convention center, it probably would have been more like $15 to $20. So that's why I parked there. It was about a 6-block walk, I think, something like that. I didn't measure it exactly, but something like 6 blocks. I got to the convention center around 9:15. The show opened at 10 o'clock. Unlike Otakon last year, which is, I know, crazy busy, even though the show expanded, there was a line, but it really wasn't that bad. I was able to walk right in. I prepaid for a ticket online a few days ago. I'd bought my ticket, so I had a printout. I handed somebody my printout. They gave me a wristband, and they told me I could get in line. So I got in line. It was, like I said, I still had about 45 minutes to go, something like that. So I listened to a podcast, a music podcast from the BBC that I like to listen to, the TR Introducing Mixtape. TR stands for Tom Robinson, who's the guy who curates the show. And so I stood in line for about 45 minutes, and eventually just before 10 o'clock, they started leading us downstairs because the main show floor was downstairs, although the panels were upstairs on the 3rd floor where we were waiting. So we walked downstairs. They let us in around 10 o'clock, and I started walking around. The first panel I wanted to go to wasn't until noon, so I had a couple hours to walk around and look around and buy stuff. I was very hesitant at first to get too close to tables. I didn't want to get sucked in and talking to somebody too much at first. In fact, I had one occasion where somebody started to talk to me, and I just kind of walked off. I guess it was a little rude, but I kind of got the feeling that he was first saying, how's it going? How's the con? And I had a feeling the next thing was going to be giving me the sales pitch, and I wasn't ready for it, and I just felt the need to move on, and so I just walked away. And I didn't go back to that table. In fact, I didn't walk through Artist Alley all that much. There was an Artist Alley where that encounter happened. Like a lot of these shows, the show floor, when you walk in, it's the same at Heroes Con. The area where you walk in is where all the retailers are, selling comic books, selling toys, books, all kinds of stuff. Puppets, costume, gear, all kinds of stuff. You've got to walk through them to get to the publishers' tables, to get to the artist tables. And I got to say, it seemed to me this year as if the Artist Alley wasn't quite as robust as it had been in the past. Maybe it was just the times that I walked through, but it just seems as if there weren't as many artists out there, or I don't know. It just felt like the retailers were more the focus this year of the showroom floor. Anyhow, I walked around for a while. I zigzagged back and forth. At one point, I ended up at a table at a booth where they had a company called Welcome Back Comics. Kind of like Welcome Back Cotter, except Welcome Back Comics. So they had a bunch of boxes, like maybe 7 or 8 boxes of Bronze Age comics that they were selling for $3 a piece. They weren't bagged, they weren't boarded. Most of them, I'd say, were anywhere from good to fine condition. I was really looking more for dollar comics than $3 comics, but I took a look through anyway. And I ended up picking up a issue of World's Finest Comics, World's Finest number 247. And what prompted me to pick this up is that it is one of the first appearances of, well, this comic has a bunch of stories in it, and one of them is a Wonder Woman story, which is one of the first appearances of Baron Blitzkrieg, who later appeared in All-Star Squadron a couple times. He showed up within the first 10 issues a couple times. Well, at least, within around issue like 7, 8, maybe even 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, somewhere around there. And then he showed up again later on in the 30s. And that may have been it. Or he may have showed up again. I can't remember exactly. But you can always check out comicbookdb.com and look up Baron Blitzkrieg, and then you can get a full listing of all his appearances. So I had to buy it because of that, because I always liked him as a villain, even though he does look kind of silly. I mean, his costume does involve, he wears a pink cape. And I guess and he was originally a Golden Age Wonder Woman villain. I didn't know that when I was reading All-Star Squadron back in the day, but I found that out a little while, a few years back when I was trying to get more information about his original appearances. So, and the other thing that's interesting about it is his costume's a little different. Instead of having 2 eye holes because he has a metal mask, kind of like Iron Man does. And once again, getting back to his costume, it's a yellow costume, yellow and brown, or yellow and orange, with a pink cape. Yes, that's your Nazis for you. Frightening, but. And, of course, a big swastika on his chest. Well, a swastika, anyway. And on his biceps. So this issue is pretty neat, because in addition to that, you've also got a Superman story. I think it's a Superman story. No, it's more than just a Superman. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Vigilante, Green Arrow, and Black Canary. Oh, wait a minute. Are these all different stories? First it opens with a Superman-Batman story. I haven't read this. I read part of the Wonder Woman story, but I haven't read. And then there's a Black Canary story, which kind of caught my eye because the art looked kind of interesting. I mean, the artist is Sal Amendola. I'm not familiar with him. It was written by Jerry Conway. I am familiar with Jerry Conway. I believe he's the one who wrote The Death of Gwen Stacy and the Green Goblin. So you've got a Black Canary story in here. Then there's a Green Arrow story. And this is, of course, these are all Earth 1 characters. And then there's a vigilante story. And this is the vigilante. This is the cowboy who rides on a motorcycle vigilante from Earth 2. Although I'm not sure if what time period this story is set in. No, I'm not sure. Oh, and the artwork's by Gray Morrow. Very interesting. Nice. Yes, I hadn't really looked through this. And then one thing that I love are the little bits that they include in here, like the Daily Planet, which was this, you could find them, they ran for like about 4 or 5 years, I think, in DC Comics. It was kind of a page that gave you like previews of what was coming out, and, like a little blurb, like 2 or 3 paragraphs. Like here they have one on Superman Spectacular, although it doesn't list an issue number. I wonder if this was just a special. And then there's another one on Karate Kid number 11. And then you've got the Answer Man in here, which was Bob Rozakis, who people would write in and ask questions like, how did Tarzan get into the hands of Marvel? And because Tarzan was originally, well, at one point there was a DC Tarzan comic, and I'm looking at the column right now that, and some people ask silly questions which had absolutely nothing to do with comics. But and then there's a letters page here for World's Finest, although there's only a couple letters on it, and with some responses. There's a publishorial from Jeanette Kahn, Whatever Happened To, fill in your favorite canceled title, and there's a response from Jeanette Kahn, who was the publisher back then. And then you have DC profiles. I have a few other issues of DC Comics that have these DC profiles in them, where they profile somebody who works at DC Comics. In this case, it's Julia Schwartz, and this is DC profile number 19. I think I have the DC... I started to scan these when I started to find them, and I think I also have one which has Walt Simonson in it. And then the last story in here is the Wonder Woman story, which I believe includes Mademoiselle Marie. Yes, it does. Very interesting. The only downside was that it turns out that this is part 2 of a 2-parter, and I went back to their table later on, but I was unable to find issue 246 of World's Finest. And this is a little beat up. If it weren't for the Baron Blitzkrieg appearance, I probably wouldn't have bought it. And it also has a really cool picture on the cover with Batman taking over the world, cover by Jose Luis Garcia-Lopez and Dick Giordano. Very nice. Okay, so the other comic I bought from Welcome Back Comics was Brave and the Bold number 150. I went through the box. I was kind of hoping I'd find number 200, but then, of course, they didn't have that there. That's a pretty rare issue, tough find. But 150's always had a cool cover. I thought it was kind of neat, saying, because usually Brave and the Bold is Batman and somebody else teaming up, and in this case it's Batman and it's got a question mark. And Batman's on the cover saying, can you discover who my co-star is in this special story? And they've got pictures of previous issues of Batman, of Brave and the Bold on the cover in the background, behind Batman, kind of in red. And so I haven't read this yet, but it looks kind of neat. So I walked around some more. I walked all the way through Artist Alley. I looked at all the people lining up for various things. I scoffed at some of the dealers who were selling things like fart comics and how to roll a joint and stuff like that. And I guess I'm a bit of a snob. I don't know. But anyway, so then I was walking around, and I happened across this table. I was looking at the comic books on the table, and this was an independent comic, and it looked familiar. And I looked up at the guy. I was like, I've read this before, and it's called Leftovers. And I recognized at least one of the covers, and he recognized me. And he was like, don't you have a blog? And he's, of course, was referring to my comic book blog, Reading for the Trade. And he remembered me because I had bought this from him 2 years ago, I think 2012 at SPX. I bought the first 3 issues from him, and he and I had written about it on my blog as well as a few other comic books, and I'll provide a link in the show notes. And I was really kind of surprised that he remembered me. Or maybe I guess he remembered that he remembered me, that he was able to make the connection between my face and the blog. And, so I bought the next 2 issues because that was all he had, issues 4 and 5. And they were $4 each. And he also gave me a bookmark and a button. And this is a different story, apparently. It's the same series, but it's a new story, and this is parts 1 and 2 of what he said is going to be a 3-part story. And the first 3 issues were all black and white. This one is black and white, but it's got some color, and but the only color is there's some superheroes in this, which I don't think there were in the first story. And I think I'm going to reread that first story before I read issues 4 and 5 and maybe discuss those on a future issue of Dave Talks Comics. So this has something to do with, there's superheroes, but most people can't see the superheroes, and so I'm curious to see, and that's about all I remember about his sales pitch. But I remember I enjoyed it before, although I still haven't gone back to look at the blog post from a couple years ago when I wrote about the first 3 issues. But so that was a really, and his name is Jason Pittman, and the series is called Leftovers, and he did a nice job with the first few issues, and these issues look good too. So, but like I said, I haven't read it yet. So I'm curious to see how it goes, and although it's only parts 1 and 2, and I doubt he's going to have part 3 by next week when SPX is, so I'm probably going to have to wait another year before I get part 3, but I'm looking forward to reading that. So that was everything I bought before I went to the first panel. So the first panel I went to, now I taped all these panels on my iPhone, although I don't think I'm going to release the recordings. But I did take notes also, and so I'm going to talk from my notes right now on the first panel. So the first panel I went to was at noon, and that was the spotlight on Dave Gibbons. And the panel consisted of Dave Gibbons and Barry Kitson? I believe that's it. Barry Kitson. Actually, you know what? I've got the show guide right here. It should say in there. Let's see. And yes, Barry Kitson moderated the panel. So basically it was a discussion between Barry Kitson and Dave Gibbons, and they had a little bit of time for questions from the audience at the end. So they opened up by talking about how they got into, because both Barry Kitson and Dave Gibbons are British, are from England. I believe they're both from England. They're both from the UK, certainly. And they started by talking about how they got into American comics, how they discovered American comics, how they, talking about, how they got them through American servicemen, through the PXs, and eventually they started actually importing American comics to the UK, because before, the PX, on American air bases and such were the only places you could find them, and there must have been Navy bases too there, I'm not sure. But, so they talked a little bit about that. They talked about early artistic influences, and they were talking, of course, about Dave Gibbons, but there were some common experiences. I believe Dave Gibbons is a few years older than Barry Kitson. I'm not sure exactly what the age difference is. My guess is it's not more than 10 years, but but I don't know. But I think it's more than a couple. I think it's at least 5, but I'm not certain on that. So they talked about early artistic influences, and Dave Gibbons talked about a particular story called Space Garbage by Jack Kirby, and how he had redrawn a panel of it for school when they were given the opportunity to draw something, and And so, and then later on, how he was able to actually buy the entire story. Apparently it went up for auction on Heritage Auctions, and he was able to get the entire story. And so I think he said the entire story. I don't think it's just this one page that has this particular panel that he really liked, which had a man chained to an asteroid. But anyway, so he thought that was really cool, hearing that. And he talked a little bit about creating his own comics, because he said they really weren't sure how to get into comics, both he and Barry Kitson. So they really weren't sure, being in the UK, comic books were really an American phenomenon, or the comic books that they liked, the Marvel comics, the DC comics, those were American comic books. And they couldn't imagine there was any way that somebody from the UK could make them, especially living in the UK. And it was funny because they also talked about how they both had crew cuts at one point because they felt it made them more American. And another thing they talked about was how the comic books, how one of the reasons why he couldn't imagine getting into comic books was their stereotypical views of the people who worked in comic books. Of they thought they were all Italian and all gangsters with names like Romita and Infantino, and so they were, they had these kind of, slanted views of the American comic book industry, which I'm not sure exactly how they got it. I suppose it was partly influenced by their views of the U.S. and through media, through movies and television, what they got. So then he talked about getting started in comics, not just creating his own, but actually working for some of the companies over there in the UK. He talked about an issue of Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., I believe number 13, which was drawn by Barry Windsor Smith, who was British also, and how that kind of was one of the things that motivated him to think, well, maybe I can do this. And it wasn't just the fact that Barry Windsor Smith was British, but the fact that he thought that Barry Windsor Smith did such a poor job drawing the issue. And he actually redrew the whole thing and took it in as a sample to one of these British companies. And it was kind of funny because one of the people who ended up seeing it was the guy who actually wrote the story, who was also British, and was working at this company, which I think was IPC. He said, Dave Gibbons said that some of the first work he got in comic books was lettering. He also talked about some of his first work drawing was for a comic book that was sold in Nigeria called Power Man. And this was I believe it was I'm not sure if it was an African or an African-American character. But this was a comic book that was sold in Nigeria, and they didn't have any pictures of it. Maybe you could find pictures of it on the internet. I'm not sure. I haven't tried to look for it. If I do and I find something, maybe I'll link to it. His first, I guess, big break, well, I don't know if it's first big break, but one important step in his career was getting to work for 2000 AD. And he talked about a number of things in that context. He talked about how a lot of the comic book companies in the UK would white out any signatures or any credits. There were no credits, no written by, drawn by artist or penciler or that kind of stuff. And both he and Barry Kitson talked a little bit about that, and there was somebody, he had I think it was his roommate, Mick somebody, and I never got the last name. And I couldn't think of anybody who this would be, but this is somebody who, not a roommate, but somebody who he shared a studio with, who, another comic book artist. And, so he talked a little bit about that, and he talked about, he did a Jethro Tull album cover, and I didn't write down which album it was, but he talked about meeting Ian Anderson, and I'm not sure who I have a couple Jethro Tull albums. I have Aqualung and Thick as a Brick and Heavy Horses, but I'm not too familiar with the various members of Jethro Tull, so I'm not sure if that's one of the band members, if that's their manager, or who that is. But he talked about the guy actually coming over he was still living with his parents at the time, Dave Gibbons was, Ian Anderson actually coming over to his place, and his parents' place, and knocking on the door and wanting to see the artwork for this album cover. And he apparently was paid very well for, I think he said something like £300 or something like that, which was quite good at that time. And let's see, then he talked about getting started at DC, about how he had submitted work to DC and to Marvel, and at first nothing happened, and then they came back to him. He gave them some stuff, and nothing happened at first. Let me see something here. Oh, yes, that's a different story. Okay, I'm getting my wires crossed here, or I was about to. A story popped into my head that was from a different panel. So he's talked about, but they came back to him. So he actually came to the U.S., to New York City. He visited the various offices. I believe that's what he said. And they looked at his work, but they didn't have anything for him. And so at first nothing happened, but then eventually he did get some work, and he did about a year on Green Lantern. I think I have one or two of those issues, somewhere in like the 160s, 170s, 180s, something like that, of the Silver Age Green Lantern comic. When I say Silver Age, I mean the comic that started in the Silver Age, started in the 60s and was still running in the 80s when I bought the 2 or 3 issues, 1 or 2 issues that I've got. He talked about working with Alan Moore on a comic book called Chronocops. I don't know anything about it. He talked about a couple pitches that Alan Moore and he put together, one for a Martian Manhunter book and another for a Challengers of the Unknown book, both of which were, they pitched to DC, and DC kind of said, well, no, sorry, we're doing something with those characters right now in both cases. So you can't do that. But then they went back to Alan Moore, and that's when they got him to do work on Swamp Thing. And I don't know if that was his first work for DC, but certainly it was his first steady work for DC, I believe. And then they talked about Watchmen a little bit, I think there's probably plenty of interviews out there where you can read about Dave Gibbons talking about Watchmen, and I am a great admirer. I love that story. I only read it for the first time about 5, 6, 7 years ago, something like that, and I was blown away by it. And then they answered some questions. He talked a little bit about, somebody asked about meeting Jack Kirby, and he had met Jack Kirby, but he didn't have a really great story on that. But Barry Kitson had a story about meeting Jack Kirby, because at one point he was working I think he was working on the Lois and Clark TV show, and somehow Michael Caine was involved. And I used to watch Lois and Clark a little bit, but I can't remember everything about it. And I didn't watch every single episode, but maybe Michael Caine was involved at some point in the show. And he didn't make a big deal about meeting Michael Caine, but apparently then a couple days later he got to meet Jack Kirby, and that was a big deal to him. And his wife apparently gave him a hard time about that, who's this Kirby guy, I mean, you get to meet Michael Caine and you didn't bat an eyelash, and this Kirby guy, I mean, what's up with that? So that was about it. I need to go back and listen through the recording of this panel. And once I do, something else may occur to me. It may jog my memory a little bit. But it was a fun panel. It was definitely well worth it. The room was not full, but it was a very big room. But there was a decent crowd there. I'd say 50 people? I don't know. Maybe not quite 50. I'm not sure exactly how many. I'm sure at least 30 or 40 people there to hear him talk. And And actually, I unintentionally ended up sitting behind his wife and his dealer, the guy who sells his artwork. So that was kind of funny because his wife had gone out of the room at the beginning of the panel, and she came back in, and I didn't know that it was his wife, and he said to her, "Yeah, you're in the right place." And then he said, "This is my wife," so that was kind of funny. But okay, so let's see. Okay, I'm going to talk a little more, and then I think I'm going to break it off. My original idea was to talk about Baltimore in one chunk, and that'd be one episode, but I can see I've already been talking for over 20 minutes, and I've only gotten through the first panel, and I've got 2 more panels to go, and there's other stuff I want to talk about. I want to talk about some of these comics I bought, and I bought quite a few comics, so I'm going to talk... Actually, why don't I cut it off right here? So this will be the end of the first part. And yes, this will be the end of part 1. A few notes before I close up for this episode. I did a little bit of research on some things. I went back and I listened to both the audio that I just played, my recollections of the beginning of the show, my first couple hours at the show, 3 hours, maybe 3. And I also listened to the audio that I recorded of the Dave Gibbons panel. And there was a few things I want to say. First off, on the Dave Gibbons panel, when I talked about it, I was talking from my notes. There may be a couple small errors there. I don't think there's any egregious errors, but I think for the most part I stuck pretty close to what he actually said and what Barry Kitson actually said. I have been thinking about it. I've decided I'm not going to release it as the audio from the panel as a podcast episode, but I think I will make it available in case anybody wants to download it, listen to it. It's not going to be in the podcast feed. It will be on the episode page, though. There will be a link to it there. It's not an MP3 file because I recorded this on my iPhone 4, so it's like an M4A file or something like that. I have done a little bit of research on some of the stuff that Dave Gibbons talked about. The Power Man comic that he worked on, I did find a Wikipedia entry for it, so I will provide a link to that. And I also found several web pages which had art from the Chronocops story that he did with Alan Moore I think it was at 2000 AD. So I'm going to provide a link to the Google search for that because there's a number of results that turn up. I'm not sure that one is any better than the other. Some are mainly pictures. Some have a lot more detailed text about it. Possibly too much. I'm not sure. I did find the story that Dave Gibbons talked about, the space garbage story that was done by Jack Kirby, which I don't think I mentioned this in the episode, but was inked by Al Williamson, and I believe was written by Joe Simon. And it has been collected, and actually Dave Gibbons mentioned that in the panel. And so that's available. Some of the pages from it are available online, but not all of them. So I guess if you want the full story, you're going to have to you're going to have to buy the collection, which is a collection of old science fiction stories that Simon and Kirby did. Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. There was an artist who I mentioned, and I got a little confused, and I will make a correction here, and that's I mentioned at one point there was an artist who was paid to white out people's signatures, and I said it was somebody named Mick or Nick something, and I didn't have the last name. There was somebody by that name who they talked about in the panel, and even listening to the panel again, I couldn't figure out what exactly his last name was. But it was Kevin O'Neill was the artist whose job it was to white out names on artwork, not them. On the subject of Jethro Tull, I looked it up online, and the album that Dave Gibbons drew the art for, and I think it's more than just the cover, and I found a blog post from a number of years ago which shows the art. I'll include a link to that. But the album's title was Too Old to Rock and Roll, Too Young to Die. And as far as Ian Anderson goes, he was the lead singer. He's a British singer-songwriter, best known as the lead vocalist, flautist, and acoustic guitarist for Jethro Tull. So he plays a number of instruments, and I'm looking at his Wikipedia page. So I think if you Google Ian Anderson, Jethro Tull, you should find a link to this. So that's, yes. And one other thing, and this is unrelated to the Dave Gibbons panel, but something that I discussed in this episode, Leftovers by Jason Pittman. I went back and I looked through my blog, and I saw that, yes, it was 2012 when I bought the first 3 issues, but I didn't do anything other than mention them in my blog. I didn't review them or talk about them, because I don't like to say I write reviews, because, I don't know, I like to think of reviews as something a little more formal, a little more structured than what I do. But so I think there's plenty of good reason then for me to reread the first 3 issues before I read the 4th and 5th issues, which I just bought, and review them on a future episode of Dave Talks Comics, hopefully not too far down the road. That's it for episode 43 of Dave Talks Comics. The first of 3 episodes on Baltimore Comic-Con. I honestly wanted to do this all in one, but when I started talking about it, once I realized it was going to take too long, and I actually ended up recording more than 90 minutes worth of me talking about the panels, about stuff I did, stuff I saw, and you add the little bits I put on at the beginning and the end like this, and it's probably going to be an hour and 45 minutes altogether, and so I feel more comfortable releasing it as 3 episodes, and it's pretty neatly broken up. Each segment is about a half hour, not including the stuff I add at the beginning and the end, and rather than number them as episode 43.1, .2, and .3, it'll be 43, 44, and 45. And the way I think about it, it's kind of like when DC or Marvel double ships, except for I'm triple shipping this in this case. You're going to get 3 episodes this week instead of just 1. And so that's it for this episode. On the next episode, I will be talking about the more time that I spent on the floor looking for stuff, and the next panel that I went to, which was a panel on pros who came out of fanzines and fandom. Thank you for listening.